what would be worth a day, and she said it'd be worth several $100,000. But it, his deed is on file there in the recorder's office in Salt Lake, and I've seen the copy of his deed. But grandfather was an educated man. He knew values, and it was when he was in Utah after he'd been here just 5 years, and in 1852 he was called on a mission to go back to England, and he left grandma, and they had 3 children, I think, at that time, and they were left there to make a living for themselves because transportation, you see, there's no railroads, and I frequently wondered how Grandma lived while he's off on his mission. And he's gone not for 30 months or 2 years as now, but he's gone for 4 years. They called him for a long time because it was hard to get it to go on a mission. You see, you had to go by ox team back to New York, cross the plains, and then you had to cross the ocean in old sailing vessels. Take you a couple of months to cross the ocean. And so when you once got over to England on a mission, they kept him there for 4 years. And it was in 1856 that he was released from his mission after being there for about 4 years. And he was placed in charge of a group of Latter-day Saint people that were coming to Utah at that time. And of course he knew the risks, he knew the difficulties, and he was placed in as captain of that group of 500 on their way to Utah. They left Liverpool in England along the forepart of June. It was early in June, and they crossed the ocean safely, and they landed in New York, and then from there they could take a train for 100 miles or so, but then he was in Nauvoo there, and then from there on, they'd expected to have other handcarts ready for them, but so many came that the men making the handcarts didn't have them ready. So they had to pitch in and make their handcarts. And they made them out of what wood was handy, and there was a green wood. They wasn't seasoned wood at all. And that's one thing, one difficulty they had on their trip across the plains was the fact that they had to keep mending their handcarts. They'd dry out, and they'd have difficulty in handing their handcarts. Now, another important thing that historians fail to note, when you see pictures of handcart companies, that's entirely wrong. It shows a man pulling a handcart. I think the one in Salt Lake shows that the bulk of his company was women and children. I'd say 3/4 of his company was made up of women and children. And the women had to pull those hand carts. There are probably more women pulling those hand carts than men. That was the situation. And then, of course, they just had a wagon or two to take all the sick. But they left then along in June and crossed in Nebraska. Of course, at that time, Nebraska was just a plains, and they had no difficulty, but they got in the far west, the last civilized town, last civilized area, along in August, and it was getting late. It was getting late in the season, and grandfather knew it, and some of the others in the company knew it, but the Saints were anxious to go on. They'd come this far and they were anxious to go on, so they determined to start out and pulling those old hand carts. And one other thing that's entirely wrong on church history, if you see the handcart company, there they are, they're parked in a nice grove and trees all around and nice running water, and that's entirely wrong. There was no trees and there was no running water. After they left the Platte River, that was their end of their water, and there were no nice groves. A lot of these pictures, you'd think that out there just was a picnic, but that was out of the question. And they knew the season was late, and pulling those hand carts, they'd make maybe 12 miles a day was a limit. That was a good day's trip. And they were limited on the amount of the things they could have in the cart. I think each individual was limited to 17 pounds of produce in his cart. That's all they could have, food and clothing. And of course, up to that time, the weather had been so warm and good. If an individual had a heavy coat, like these heavy coats you're wearing, they laid them aside. Well, boy, this nice hot weather, we no need of this big heavy coat. And so they left the winter quarters there and started out. And they journeyed on until they got to out in Nebraska and out in Wyoming at the camp there, camp on the east end of Wyoming. I forget its name, but I've been there.
Fort Bridger.
And that was the last supplies that they could take on. They took on what supplies that they could, and up until that time, things hadn't been too bad for them. But now from here on, they're running in trouble. Ordinarily, the month of October out in Wyoming is a fair, free of storms. But this winter started in early. Boy, I don't know the reason, but the snow came, and those of you acquainted with Wyoming, know the wind. It blows every day. It's cold out there, and the snow piled up 18 inches high, and there they were lugging their hand carts through the snow in those blizzards, and they carried on with them and followed up the Platte River, followed along the river course. I've been out there on that trail that they have. They crossed the river 3 or 4 times, pulling those carts from a Devil's Gate, and it was rough going. It was terribly rough. And they finally, along in late October, they'd run out of food. And grandfather had to limit them on their food supply. They were finally ended up, I think, about 10 ounces of food a day. That's all day, 10 ounces of food. You know that isn't very much, but a meager supply. And their clothing, they didn't have any winter clothing, and they've been just as far as they could go there on South Pass. One thing I might mention on South Pass, I've been there several times. It isn't a canyon, it isn't a one road. South Pass extends out. It's a high mountain plain. Oh, I'd say maybe 8 miles across. And there's a lot of trails. Each company could select their own trail. And finally, they'd gone as far as they could, as like pictured in this picture I have there. And they'd run out of food. They'd given the last ounce. And I remember talking to Sister Ella Heron White there at Brigham City back in 1935. She was in grandfather's company. She was just a girl about 6 years old at that time. And she said they'd just gone as far as they possibly could. And grandfather knew from missionaries that they passed, that relief wagons were on their way to help them. And this held conference in Salt Lake the 1st of October, and President Brigham Young, on the very first day of conference, he said, "I'm dismissing conference. We won't have any meetings, but I want the next day or two 50 wagons to be loaded with clothing and with food and on their way back east, because our saints crossing the plains are running into trouble." And those relief wagons were soon ready and on their way. And grandfather knew that they were coming, and he thought the thing to do is to try to go ahead. He'd run out of food, and they were freezing to death. To try to go ahead and meet those relief wagons and have them hurry. And so, with another man, they walked from this camp that's pictured there through the snow, and you kind of wondered their clothing that they had. Grandfather, he had his legs wrapped in gunny sacking. He didn't, there were no, you see pictures of maybe Handcarts, the men wearing Levi's, but none of them were wearing Levi's. They were just any old rags that they could possibly have. And he had his legs wrapped in gunny sacking, and he went ahead, and the relief wagons, it was kind of a miracle. Of course, the wind would blow the snow in, so the tracks were covered, but he felt that he should leave the trail he was on and go down to the Sweetwater River. The Sweetwater River in Wyoming, it flows west, and he left along. There'd be no one there to help. And so they hooked up their horses again. The relief wagons were being pulled by horses, and they hurried on west as long as their horses could take them, and then camped, and then a few hours, and then carried on till they met the company. And boy, you can imagine the rejoicing of the women and the children and the men that were there to see those relief wagons coming with clothing and food for them. And I've talked to Sister White personally. She used to live there in the 3rd Ward in Brigham City. That was along about 1935, I think, that time when I was talking with her. And she was well up in her 80s. A fine woman living alone. And she said they journeyed on, she placed in a relief wagon, and it had the hardships, of course, to carry on to Fort Bridger, and then from Fort Bridger on down Echo Canyon, and then over the mountain to come down into Salt Lake. And in that freezing weather of that time of the year. And she said when they got in Salt Lake, their wagon stopped on a square that was right where the Hotel Utah is now located. And they stopped there, and of course, that's as far as they could go. And she said her legs were so frozen, she had to be lifted out of the wagon. And her father had sent for doctors to come and look at her legs. And they came and looked at her legs, and they said, they shook their head, and they said the only way you can save the life of this little girl is to amputate one leg above the knee and the other leg right underneath the knee. And she said her father objected to that. He said, my little daughter had not walked 1,300 miles across the plains to come out here and have her legs amputated. And so her mother soaked the rags off from her legs. The rags on her legs were frozen on there, and her mother soaked the rags off so the doctors could see her legs. But they came back the next morning, and her father said, "I'm not going to have her legs amputated." And so later on, of course, they settled there, and as I mentioned, Father had that lot in Salt Lake, and he had a cabin on it, and Sister White said that after they came even up to Brigham City, her father used to walk down to Ogden and get some fresh meat, and they'd pack fresh meat on her legs, and the veins in her legs had absorbed energy from that fresh meat, and that was her nourishment. And she said it was 3 long years before I was able to walk.
Hi.
So that was her story. Nice fella. They then went over to Minden. He was one of the very first settlers in Minden. And Minden, when it started, it had a fort. It had to have a fort against the Indians. And that fort was on the square, on the south side of the square. But as the Indian damage lessened, they was able to build that little house there just north of the church house. Occasional opportunities I've had. I'm grateful above all else for my family, for my children. And I have 2 choice sons and 3 very competent, capable daughters. All of them are wonderful. And I have many blessings and a comfortable home, plenty of clothing. And here I am now, 91 and a half years old. And so I have no complaints. And I'm happy to have you come, although it's winter, it's cold. I surely appreciate having you. So that's pretty much my heritage. Going back 100 years in Utah, St. George was not much of a community at that time. They had hardships down here. Around town, behind some of the homes, you see sort of a cellar-looking affair, and that's where they lived. I don't know. I feel sorry down here. I feel sorry for the women, especially. The women were cooped up in that little one-roomed house, and of course the men, they're outside stirring around in the air, but the woman was confined right, that's almost the days, in those little cabins behind the houses. There's still a few of them left around here in St. George.
Well, that's certainly won't go to waste, you know, we always drink it, you know.
Today's December 27th, 1990.
As long as we have a little sunshine.